Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. This is Jeremy Martin, Vice President for Energy and Sustainability at the Institute of the Americas, and welcome to the latest installment of our energy webinar series, the 2018 Energy Webinar Series. And we're delighted to be speaking today and beginning our webinar series today with a discussion of climate resilience in the Caribbean, what we're hoping to talk about on the side of building the business case. And we're very pleased to have two presenters today. Mark Lambrides, who many of you probably know for his time at the OAS in the Energy and Sustainability Office there at the Organization of American States, and now he's at the World Bank working on these issues related to climate, energy, and sustainability. And Adam Borison, a Vice President at Nathan Associates, who likewise has spent many years working on climate and sustainability and energy issues with a particular focus on the Caribbean. So we're very pleased we'll have both Adam and Mark, and we'll begin with Mark. But just in the way of a quick background, I don't think I need to give a huge introduction as to why we've chosen to organize and host this webinar today. The news from the last several months has been extremely noteworthy, and I think as our blurb and some of the information we'll talk about today, particularly in the case of Puerto Rico, continues to dominate the news and continues to dominate headlines. And it's spurred a whole host of conversations around what really could be a solution, or what could be some options to build resiliency, to be prepared for disasters, to have better energy and critical infrastructure assets managed in a fashion that when major catastrophic climate events happen, and they're increasingly happening, that they are, as I said, perhaps in a more resilient fashion. There are a whole host of issues in our conversation today with Mark Lambrides from the World Bank. The World Bank, along with other multilateral development banks, specifically the Inter-American Development Bank, are working and building up a specific fund, and there's a host of coordinated efforts, both in the financing but also technical assistance realm, to be able to not just simply respond to this current environment of disaster response, but to build a much more sustainable path forward with regards to this topic. So the plan is for this webinar to, as I said, we'll begin with a presentation from Mark Lambrides, who will lay out some of the key elements of the bank strategy, the World Bank strategy vis-a-vis the Caribbean and climate and resilience matters. And then we'll have Adam share some of his interesting ideas with potential solutions and what he thinks are mechanisms and ideas and ways to think about this, that the cliche is to how to think outside the box, but I think that's indeed what we hope to do with both presentations, and we'll complement Mark's bank presentation with Adam's presentation as well, especially how to deal with some of these matters. So just a quick reminder for those of you who haven't joined us, we managed the question and answer session via the chat function on your screen there. Feel free during any point of the formal presentation to pose a question, and you do that via the chat function. I see some of you have been very generous to say good morning and good afternoon, and it's a pleasure to have you online with us. But you can pose your questions there, like I said, anytime during the course of the webinar, either during Mark or Adam's presentations, and then we'll come back to those. We will hold the questions until after the presentation, so we'll have both presentations of about 15 minutes each, 20 minutes each maximum, and then we'll come back and hopefully have about 15 minutes of opportunity for Q&A. And I'll be delighted to receive those and manage the Q&A with Mark and Adam at the end of their formal presentations. So I don't want to take any more time away, and it's a pleasure to again welcome. This is not either one of these gentlemen's first rodeo with the Institute, but it's always great. I think probably the first time I ever had them both together on a dance card. So Mark Lambrides, thanks so much for kicking this off and sharing your latest work and that of the World Bank in terms of climate resilience in the Caribbean.
Thanks, Jeremy. Beginning of my presentation here. Okay, so good afternoon, good morning to everyone. It's a pleasure to have the opportunity to talk with you all today about this really critical challenge of extreme weather events. The Caribbean is no stranger to hurricanes and other storms and natural hazards, but certainly the last year, the last hurricane season was particularly challenging, with both Irma and Maria hitting and laying swath of damage throughout the region. The World Bank, as an institution, has worked for many years in disaster risk management and in attempting to address challenges of natural hazards with our partner countries throughout the region. But generally, that work has been multi-sectoral, and so we've had many programs wherein we've tried to address roads and housing, public infrastructure, and including the energy sector. But over the last couple of years, even in advance of the last season, the last hurricane season, we have been working to become more specific and provide more direct assistance to our member states, specifically in the power sector. That being due to the fact that the power sector, as you all know, is so directly linked to the wider economy. And so when power is out, not only does it hinder recovery efforts, but also over the longer term, without access to electricity, rejuvenating the economy becomes particularly challenging. So, with that in mind, we've been working to develop a program that we can roll out with our member states. And since I work in the Latin American Caribbean region, in particular throughout the Caribbean, I've been particularly focused on the kinds of solutions that we can deliver for our Caribbean member states. So first off, what does climate resilience mean specifically for the energy sector? And this slide I'll just read. It says the ability of the energy system to cope with or recover from hazardous event, trend, shock, or stress that is climate related, such as hurricanes, sea level rise, temperature, flood, and similar. Quite obvious. And so I want to provide just a little bit of a backdrop for the evolution of our thinking in this space. And really, this goes back to 2015, 2016. We began conversations with the government of Belize and started to look at the kind of vulnerabilities that Belize, the power sector, faced to natural hazards. And so in the kind of work that we did, it really has helped lead to the development of the program that we're working on today. And as you can see, this report, this analytical report called The Power System in the Eye of the Storm, was an effort to assess everything from the kinds of vulnerabilities, gaps, and potential solutions in the energy sector to address hurricanes and other natural hazards. And you can see the kinds of components that went into this study. This study, again, the Power System in the Eye of the Storm, is available for download through the HTTP link that you can see at the bottom of the page. And so this really is just intended to share with you kind of the thought process that led us to the next round of program development. So included in that report, and some of the things you'll see, is a quick mapping of the recent, and this really goes back to 2000, so the last 16, 18 years, of hurricanes and tropical storms that hit Belize. And this is not, we're not intending for us to go in this in any detail. I'm just trying to provide a little bit of the background for the thinking around the design of some of the potential interventions and the kinds of resilience measures that can be utilized to address resilience measures. And so I just want to take on one recent event, somewhat recent. This was from 2007, and we picked this to talk about now just because it was such a significant event. This was Hurricane Dean, which was a Cat 5 hurricane, as I said, in 2007. And to do the kind of work that we're doing, first in Belize and now in the OECS. We wanted to analyze the history of the event and and get a sense of the sort of the evolution of the breakdown and the kinds of challenges the country faced in the power sector in the wake of the storm. And so here you have just the data regarding the storm, and then some of the analytical work that followed. And again, I don't want to go into the details, but it's very easy to see that based on the timing of the hurricane event and the outages, the instantaneous outages leading to total blackout, the correlation is significant. And again, in this next slide, you can see some of the causes and some of the locations of the blackouts that occurred during the course of the storm. And so we went in and analyzed, working together with BEL, the utility, and we analyzed some of the various events. It's important to note that virtually all of the grid was down. Only about 3% of normal dispatch was available for this given time, and most customers throughout the country, 88% or more, were without power. And so knowing that, we went and then looked at what are the consequences, what are some of the economic consequences of the immediate effect of that storm. If you see here some of the impacts and based on the GDP, these are rather loose numbers, but here we tried to look at the effects of loss of value to BEL, the utility, and also the loss to customers who suffered without electricity for a matter of days. And so further getting into details regarding the outages, one of the things when we started to dig deeper and look at potential solutions for how can BEL, how can the government of Belize better improve the resilience to prevent such a total loss of the system for future storms. And it was quickly determined that segmentation was one of the primary investment areas where energy could be conserved by segmenting off sections that go down in a particular storm from the rest of the network. And so this is one of the key areas that was identified. Similarly, looking at some of the things that led to lines being lost, it was noted that vegetation was a critical cause for a lot of the outages. Not trimming back vines and brush and trees was really a critical issue leading to outages, and the extra weight on lines was an important cause to the hazards the outages that later resulted. And so for any system that we work with, certainly this kind of low-hanging fruit, really developing a better program of vegetation management is a critical recommendation going forward. So I really don't want to spend any more time looking at the situation in Belize. I will say that based on that analytical work and the document that we've shared, we have developed a program with the government of Belize. We went to the Global Environment Facility, and with $8 million of support from the GEF plus counterpart from the government and utility of BEL, are working with Belize to put in place a variety of measures, including the two that I mentioned, segmentation and vegetation management, but also things like redundancy, switches, and others that can help to prevent future hazards. Now, what I want to do is turn to the wider Caribbean, actually a little less specific, a little less wide than the total, but to focus in on the countries in the OECS. That is the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States. And for the World Bank, the independent countries of the OECS are the ones on the left that are listed. Actually, it lists more than just those, because I think it lists the French islands of Martinique and Guadeloupe. But there's 6 countries within the OECS that are World Bank member states and with whom we are working and with whom we're developing a program to address power sector resilience. And so I'll kind of start over the same logic as above and try to describe the kind of program that is emerging for the OECS, and hopefully we can have some results, at least some solid recommendations before the next hurricane season to work with the OECS states and in an effort to prevent the kind of repeat of large-scale outages that we experienced in 2017. Why are we doing it? Well, as Jeremy referred to earlier, the hazards of the Hurricane 2017 were particularly significant. Hurricane Irma, which struck Barbuda first in last year, destroyed the entire electricity grid and quite frankly wiped out virtually all of the housing stock of the country. I had the challenge and opportunity of traveling to Barbuda after the storm in helping to design a recovery program for Barbuda, a small island of 1,700 people, part of the twin island nation of Antigua and Barbuda. And so working with Barbuda, we helped them design a recovery program for that power sector, and we're looking at other interventions to support both hospital, schools, and other. In the case of Dominica, where Hurricane Maria hit last year, the bank actually had 3 of my colleagues on the ground during the storm who were trapped there for several days and have firsthand experience from that disaster. Hurricane Maria wiped out about 98% of all power through transmission and distribution, plus much of the generation assets in Dominica. Other storms, excuse me, of recent years are notable. In Grenada, Hurricane Ivan 2004 was really quite a significant effect, with 80% electricity distribution out, and took many, many years for full recovery in the case of Grenada. I won't go through any more of these, but just to note that the whole Eastern Caribbean is particularly vulnerable to the impacts of such disasters. These are just a few of the photos from Hurricane Irma and Maria, Dominica, and Barbuda for a bit of reference. The top row I took in Barbuda. So again, linking the disasters to economic losses. This chart is not updated after 2014. The data isn't yet available to include 2017. The most important thing here is that you see that all 6 independent countries of the Eastern Caribbean, ranging from Grenada to St. Lucia, are among the top 20 most vulnerable to extreme weather events worldwide. So this is a region that is particularly vulnerable to such effects. Irma caused an estimated 14% of Antigua Barbuda's economy to be lost, given that Barbuda is only 1,700 persons of the total 100,000 of Antigua Barbuda. It's quite a significant loss. And we estimate that Maria alone damaged an estimated over 200% of the economy in the case of Dominica. So in the case of OECS, and we're working with each of the countries, but now starting our focus in St. Lucia and St. Vincent and the Grenadines, we're working to provide support to both utilities and the policymakers such that they can build power networks that are more resilient to extreme weather and climate risks, and also design rapid response and recovery mechanisms to tackle future such events. I want to point out that the work that we're doing in the design of this OECS program and the foundation of the approach that's being taken in Belize is really driven from some work going back in the World Bank from Ebinger and Vergara to 2011, laying out a comprehensive integrated strategy for addressing resilience really across the board, but this has been specified or made more specific for the energy sector. And what I think is important and unique about the World Bank's approach here for the power sector is that we're not just talking about a single aspect, not just generation, transmission, distribution, but also planning and operations on the front end, strengthen the overall system resilience. We're looking also at the inevitability of some events causing damage and planning for and being better prepared for the immediate recovery efforts, and then certainly having plans and resources in place to address the long-term reconstruction of the power sector and other sectors. So what we've been doing of late, and with resources, grant resources from within the World Bank, is to begin an effort with the countries in the OECS along a systematic, really assessment approach. We don't want to begin making recommendations regarding solutions without a real clear picture on the kinds of vulnerabilities, where are the gaps, what's already in place, who's doing what, and what kind of investments can be made. Certainly looking at the biggest bang for the buck, the lowest hanging fruit in the short run in order to address these challenges. So we're looking first at the kinds of climate risks that the countries face, given their location, the geography, and other, and then doing a vulnerability assessment of the sector so that we can get a better sense of where are their particular vulnerability challenges in the power sector, whether that's power lines in flood-prone areas, power stations where sea level or flood may rise, and potentially where cables could come down, where vegetation is particularly thick. And so not just as a desk study, but our walkthrough of the different elements within the power sector in each of the countries so that we can get a better sense of the vulnerabilities, and then doing a gap analysis to get a sense of what's in place. And finally, evaluating different ways in which they can adapt and do long-term planning to address hazards. At the end of this, develop a comprehensive and custom program for each country based on both their vulnerabilities and the available resources to address challenges going forward. And so this, the last slide, which I will share, is a little busy, I know, and I don't want to go into every detail, but it extends from the slide you saw earlier with the top framework. In each category, I wanted to give a sense of the kinds of investments that can be made. And when I say investments, I'm talking about everything from lending, low-cost lending from institutions like the World Bank and CDB and others, but also grant funding. And there's certainly a large amount of donor funding flowing in to the region after last year's hazards, and we look forward to working to raise additional grant funding for many of these solutions. But certainly we start the conversation with the countries looking at what the financial resources are available to them, and then help them to identify additional resources as available. And so the kinds of things that could come out in this exercise for investment, obviously looking at long-term planning, working with the government, with the disaster agencies and with the ministries of energy, segmentation of the various networks, as I mentioned before, improving meteorological and hydrological data and monitoring systems, and improving operational dispatch capacity within the utilities, including the development of backup control centers. And then for strengthening real investments in transmission and distribution upgrades, and this seems obvious, but a lot of the poles in the region are very weak, oftentimes rotted, blow over very easily. We saw lots of poles in Barbuda that literally broke in half or were rotted and simply fell over at the base. And so undergrounding lines, this is a particularly expensive investment, undergrounding lines and or putting in more resilient, oftentimes concrete poles is an option. And then on the generation side, various options from improving the resilience of existing plants, building new plants in less flood-prone areas, but also a topic I don't want to get into a lot here, but a real important investment area is in space of distributed and diversified energy assets. And so potentially investing in renewables like solar PV, oftentimes with battery backup spread around the country, combined with switching and better segmented networks, may allow for turning back on power systems which are otherwise dependent on a sole source, a single source generation asset in the one location, a center location of the country. On the response and recovery side, certainly looking at the better response plans, how the government and the utility respond, looking at preventative measures, as I mentioned before, so vegetation management, and then improving awareness and communication during emergencies. We heard from at a recent workshop on this topic, which took place at the Caribbean Renewable Energy Forum, we heard from people who have worked with Japanese utilities and Florida Power and Light about the importance of having an extensive number of communication tools, backup radios, and we saw even in the wake of the storm in Dominica the importance of communication. And when it failed in Dominica, in many cases the only way to communicate with the island was through a series of ham radio operators. In fact, we heard from the Prime Minister via a private ham radio operator in the early days after the storm. Finally, on the money side, the bank will certainly be working with the countries on establishing resources, whether that's insurance or guarantee mechanisms, but a pool of funds so that in the unfortunate events of disasters, the country has the ability to invest in recovery. We're seeing that this is a problem, for example, in Dominica, where the utility did not have specific insurance for recovery efforts. And so it's much more difficult after the fact to identify and deploy resources. So planning ahead for financial resources in advance of storms is a part of the solution that we are proposing. And so I'm going to end there. I'm going to turn over to my friend and colleague Adam. Ask you and some more questions after.
Thank you so much, Mark. Adam, definitely want to throw it over to you. I think that was a nice segue. I know Adam and some of the discussions we've had in his work, I think this is a perfect segue. Adam's sometimes used terms with me like show me the money and how do you allocate sources, and so I think that's the perfect segue. And we gave this event the subtitle of Building the Business Case because I think everything that Mark laid out there, the key piece here is the economic impact. And if you look at some of those impacts on GDP and you look at the impact in critical segments of the economies, whether it's transport, telecom, healthcare, I mean, this is to say disruptive would be an understatement. So there's a business case, and I appreciate Adam for sharing that with us going forward. Over to you, Adam, and then we'll come back to the questions. I see folks are already posing some questions, so keep at it. And over to you, Adam Borison. Thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone. Can everyone hear me? I hope. I guess if you can't, you'll let me know. I thought, first, greetings to everyone, and again, thank you for listening in. I think this dovetails extremely well with what Mark just talked about, so let me kind of jump in. As Mark has shown, as we all understand, there is a lot of talk about resilience and what the impact was of the hurricane season. And there's a lot of interest in moving forward. There's this recognition, as it says on the slide, that these systems are really too big to fail. They have massive impacts if they do fail, and we need to do something about that. Very, very clear recognition of that fact. I do think it's also true, without really impugning the kind of work that's been done in the past, there really is a relative lack of rigorous analysis of the different investments and what you can do. And I don't think there really is yet, although it's emerging, much of a kind of like a business case around what are the right investments, how do we get bang for the buck, and all that I think is completely understandable given the recent season. And what I'd like to do here is show, mostly through an example, my perspective on how one would, on a tool really that does that basically builds on past work and available data, but builds very specifically a quantitative business case for the investments that make the most sense. And I do think that this kind of tool, this kind of approach can be highly valuable both for those people that put in money, because it makes better use of their money, but also, probably more importantly, I think it makes for the best outcomes on the ground for the people of the Caribbean. And so I have a pretty strong opinion that this kind of approach, something like this, is pretty important as we decide how much to spend, what to do to make this region, in fact, better able to withstand what apparently is a serious problem. So let me just walk through a little bit of that, in the short time we have, and happy, of course, to talk more and provide more after this. But I tried to do this in the context of a case study, and I picked Puerto Rico in large part because it's such a hot and important area and topic, but it is certainly something that can be generalized. So what I tried to do here is kind of postulate a realistic, but not illustrative example where one has a resilience issue, and then one has to figure out what to do about it. And I think all the countries in the Caribbean, OECS, Jamaica, Virgin Islands, Haiti, have this kind of problem to deal with. What do we do? And again, this is an example, concrete, but can be generalized, that shows, in my opinion, how one might approach that question. So what this example shows basically is that, as we all probably know, the hurricane season had a dramatic effect on Puerto Rico. One area that had a big effect is on hospitals. And I did a little bit of research on that, and I can't say I'm an expert at that, but it's pretty clear that hospitals and healthcare was dramatically affected by the hurricanes because of the energy infrastructure. Not so much because the hospitals were destroyed, which did happen, but because there was lack of fuel, lack of power. And I estimated, using a metric that one could use, there were probably 40,000 or more patient days without power. So you're in a hospital and there's no power. That's obviously a bad outcome. There were also side outcomes of various kinds, lack of fuel to get to the hospital, all sorts of other issues. But the question that I have is, how should we look at the problem of healthcare as an example in Puerto Rico, as an example, and how do we make that more resilient through investments in the energy infrastructure? And a lot of possibilities, but how do you choose which one to do? And this is basically what a business case would be all about. So I came up with kind of some hypothetical solutions. Again, not rocket science here, things that have been discussed. So there's a couple possibilities, several possibilities. One is, of course, not to do anything. But if you want to do something, three possibilities might be local traditional fuel, so better backup generation, more spare parts, more fuel depots. Let's make sure the hospitals in Puerto Rico have the fuel they need and the equipment they need to generate power on their own when they have to do that. That's one alternative. Another alternative is to say, well, that's fine, but what about using renewables? What about using solar and storage? But again, we'd have to harden those. We'd have to have depots for spare parts because solar panels get destroyed. That would be another alternative for helping this problem with healthcare. A third alternative would be to harden the grid near the hospitals. So again, we might have to harden it around the country, but one possibility would be to underground various kinds of things you can do near the hospitals, so we're more confident that they will get supplied power when they need to. And so the question I have for all of us, I guess rhetorical at this point, is, well, how do you make that decision? How do you build a business case that says, you know what, among those alternatives, the best use of money is A or B or C or nothing? And that's what I'd like to show. I'd like to show you one way of approaching that problem. So this slide shows this framework that I think is pretty general, but can be applied quite specifically to this problem, to walk through how would one figure out what makes the most sense. And I'll go through each of these in this example shortly, but let me just explain at a high level what it's all about. And it's not rocket science. It's stuff that stuff is a technical term. It's stuff that other people have been doing that's quite common. And so a lot of this is really putting together and assembling knowledge and information people have already. The framework basically proceeds from the left to the right. On the left side, we have events like hurricanes. That's the pretty standard problem that people have in the area. Sometimes people use the word peril. The event causes a problem like high winds, and that's a peril. That peril creates damage of individual assets like poles or substations. Importantly, that asset damage then leads to system disruption because the assets are interconnected. And that's a phenomenon that more and more people realize is critically important, the connection among those systems. And then lastly, and then very importantly, all these things lead to some outcome that, in my opinion, can be measured quite explicitly. And in my case, in the case of this problem, we're talking about the hospitals and hospital days. But my thinking is it's better to have a clear sense of what you're trying to achieve and some way of measuring that. And the last step in this framework is doing that. So let me just walk through these steps, again, at a high level, illustratively, but real, or at least realistic, how one would walk through these steps in trying to figure out, in Puerto Rico, what investments should we make to help hospitals be more resilient for the next event. And that's kind of the bottom line of all this. So let's go through that. Some of these are going to be quite similar to the slides that Mark showed, because that's a similar way of thinking. So one of the first things to think about is the event, the underlying problem, hurricanes. And there's a wealth of information on that. On the left side, you see the hurricane path for the region. On the right side, you see hurricane paths for Puerto Rico. You can adjust these based on your judgment about climate change, but there is no lack of information that can be turned into formal probabilistic statements about hurricane and other events in the region. And so that's readily available, and you can say quite formally what likelihood is of various events based both on data and judgment. That's step one. What is the problem we're really facing? Step two is term peril, and I apologize for some of these slides. I tried to use real material that's available publicly, and some of the slides are not the most, the easiest to read. But they are, I think the good news is these are all based on actual real work that people have done. So what this shows is what people have looked at for maximum wind speed in Puerto Rico. And in most cases, people tend to think in terms of return periods rather than probabilities. But if you can look at the slide, you can see there's some numbers there that show what people estimate the maximum wind gust might be with various return periods. For example, on the lower right, I think that's a 700-year return period, almost like a 1 in 1,000 event. And they have 170 there as the maximum wind speed they project that might happen once every 700 years. As it turns out, I believe the recent hurricane season, they did record gusts of 175. So maybe that was a 1 in 700-year event. But the main purpose of this slide is to show that one can turn the event data about hurricane paths into quite specific statements about what might happen in particular locations on an island and how damaging that might be, and a probabilistic statement. And again, that is one way of getting a real handle on the underlying risk in a quantitative way. So that's the peril. Now we could say we've taken a hurricane path, turned it into an estimate of the maximum wind speed we might face in a certain location in Puerto Rico over the next however many years. That's what that slide shows. That then is turned into damage. And again, apologize for the slide, but it is a real slide from real data. What people have done with these little diagrams is estimate how many poles will get blown over and destroyed as a function of wind speed. And the 4 different graphs show different locations for the poles. And basically what this says is that you can in fact translate something like wind speed into the fraction of poles that will get knocked over based on the location of those poles or the design of those poles. And you can generalize that to other assets like airports, seaports, telecom towers, pipelines, but one can translate an event, a hurricane, into a wind speed, and ultimately into a, guess what? All the poles that are of this design are going to get blown over in this location. And that gets us much closer to saying what ultimately would the impact be and what should we do about it. So that's asset damage. Then all 3 of those things I just mentioned are actually quite common. They're out there, they're available. You need to put the data together, but they exist. What exists less is the actual system issue, the integration issue, the connection among assets. And I put this slide together myself, so I'm not going to blame anybody else for doing it. But this shows the location in Puerto Rico, part of Puerto Rico, of hospitals and fuel depots. And this kind of slide, this kind of analysis would help someone scale up asset damage. So one could say, look, the hospital is going to be intact. The diesel generator may be intact. But how do I get fuel after 2 or 3 days to that diesel generator? And that is an interaction that's pretty important. And one can look at this kind of asset map, can understand the way these different assets relate, and say, you know what, hospital will stand, generator will work, but after 3 days, no fuel will arrive. And those are the kinds of assessments you can make if you understand the interaction, the interconnections between those assets. And that's a critical step, at least it's been shown by the recent season. So that's almost the last step. Then all that information, the event, the peril, the asset damage, the system disruption, ultimately translates into a bottom line. And again, I'm a quantitative person, so I tend to think very quantitatively. This is an example that's very much akin to VAR, the kind of analysis people do in financial risk. But what I tried to do here is show in a very specific quantitative way how one could think about what this really means for a metric that we really care about. So on this graphic, we have this patient days without power index, basically saying when it comes to healthcare and power, what I care about is how many days patients are without power. That's really an important variable. I don't care so much about whether the grid looks good or whether the diesel generator is working, or no, I don't really care about those things. Those are means to an end. The end I care about in healthcare resilience is, do patients have power? And so what this graphic says is, well, there are a lot of different possible outcomes, but the outcome you care about, the tail outcome you care about, is a lot of people without power for a long time. And on the right side, we have a metric that says, based on the information we have so far, under the status quo conditions, it looks like we might have as many as 20,000 patient days, a 5% chance of as many as 20,000 patient days without power, out of about 2 million in Puerto Rico. Now, I don't know what the right standard is, but this is the kind of thinking I think one has to do. One has to think about carefully, well, what does it mean to have a resilient healthcare system? And do we want no chance at all of power going out? Do we want a 1 in 1,000 chance, a 1 in a million chance? And how much do we have to pay for that? And so this graphic is a way of putting I'll call it actionable, not in the legal sense, but putting an actionable metric behind the whole resilience debate. Our goal is to figure out if we like that curve and to make it better if we can. And again, this is just one example of the quantitative metrics that one can use to come up with a business case around resilience. So what does all that mean? What does all that mean as far as the problem here we're facing, which is what do we do about healthcare resilience in Puerto Rico, right? That's really what we're trying to figure out how to do. And the next slide is a kind of again, illustrative. It's not a formal recommendation. It's an example, but it shows how all that work we just did, events, perils, damage, systems, metrics, all that work can lead us to a better understanding of the different alternatives and which one might be best. And again, illustratively, what I've shown here is I've indicated for each of the 4 cases, including doing nothing, I've indicated what the metrics might be. So for status quo, spend no more money than you're currently spending and face the risk you just saw in that picture of a 5% chance of more than these 20,000 days without power. For the 3 alternatives, it helps you can do more than that. So for strategy A, which would involve fuel depots, hardened diesel generators, spare parts, all that kind of work, my estimate, again, realistic but not real, about $300 million would get you to the point where you can reduce that chance of this serious healthcare problem to less than 1%. So you could spend that money and get that outcome. Interestingly, again, illustratively, you could get the same outcome by spending somewhat less on solar and storage. And again, that's based on some real numbers or realistic numbers, but I'm not making a formal recommendation. And lastly, if you wanted to say, grid hardening is a pretty good idea, it's more general, it could be applied across the island, I tried to estimate what it might cost to do that close to the hospitals and what benefit that might achieve. And of course, the problem with that is that a lot of the problems are more local, they're not really due to grid issues, so that doesn't achieve the same benefit in this example, hypothetical example. The bottom line is the modeling we've done in this approach could lead us to a very clear statement about the relative benefits and costs of these alternatives. And in this case, of course, I made the case up this way, one of the alternatives, other than the status quo, is dominant. So strategy B, the way I've put the numbers together here, would spend less money and achieve the same benefit or better than the other alternatives. So it would be pretty easy to make the case, if you don't like the status quo and want to choose between these three alternatives, and you do care about healthcare outcomes, namely patients being without power, that strategy B is the right one to invest in. And it makes the best use of money, so that's a good thing for the donors, and it has the best outcome for the patients. So I think it's a pretty strong argument for that as the alternative to improve resilience in Puerto Rico with respect to healthcare. And again, illustrative, I'm not making a recommendation, but it's the kind of approach I think that would give a more concrete result. So what does that all mean? I guess what I'd like to say about kind of the bottom line of all this is that I see this as building on and extending the work that has been done to date with a recognition of how critically important it is to make the right decisions going forward. So in Puerto Rico, again, if any of you have dealt with Puerto Rico, if you look back historically, there's a lot of recognition that it's vulnerable. So I looked at this 2013 study. No lack of understanding that Puerto Rico is vulnerable. And so we're not trying to just reproduce that. We're saying, well, that's an important thing to know. But, well, how do I quantify that? How do I make, and then of course, what do I do about it? It's also true, in the second study I found fascinating, there was a very recent study done by basically a group that was headed by some NIPA folks and had a bunch of people involved. But they essentially looked at the situation in Puerto Rico and literally recommended roughly $20 billion in rebuild. And the surprise I had was that I don't see any analysis behind that. And again, I don't want to be unfair because I don't really know exactly what they did. But it seemed to me that what that really is more seriously is a laying out of the alternatives. It isn't really a good way to make a decision about what to spend, but it's a very good way of saying, what are some of the possibilities that we might consider? And that study does a great job of laying out what are the ways we might help Puerto Rico through all sorts of different investments. But I think both the vulnerability assessment done in 2013 and the new study, which I think lays out some possibilities, both need a third element. And that element is a rigorous analysis, evaluation of the alternative investments based on metrics that are very, very clear about what we're trying to achieve. And then picking the right one based on a very clear business case involving costs and benefits. And the value add, I think, for that is that you could spend a little bit of money, maybe I think less than 1% of the investment cost, and you can both improve your use of money and improve the outcomes for people on the ground in Puerto Rico and the Caribbean. So again, you can probably tell that I have a pretty strong feeling that this kind of approach is certainly something to consider in how to respond to the quote-unquote crisis we have in dealing with resilience, particularly in the Caribbean. So with that, I will conclude and happy to answer questions or follow up after the webinar.
Thank you so much, Adam, and Mark as well for your presentations. We received some questions. Don't forget, folks, there's, and I think folks can see there, pose your questions via the chat function. I've got a couple things I want to mix in as well, but let's start perhaps with a step back, and thanks very much, Adam, for complimenting and laying out a very interesting case study on how to evaluate the risk and to deal with this question of resource allocation, because I think at the end of the day, that's one of the critical elements here. We can continue to diagnose and assess and understand the problem, but I think at the end of the day, justifying the investments for uncertain future events is always the critical question. So let's back up a little bit, because there's a lot of talk about the role of renewable energy in this discussion. And the first question we received has to do with the country's frameworks, how existing laws and regulations within Mark, you talked about the OECS, but if we could broaden it a little bit to the Caribbean in a whole, but how did the laws and regulations in the Caribbean support or perhaps fail to support deployment of renewables? And Mark, I don't know if you want to take that one, and Adam, feel free to chime in, but we'll go to Mark first.
Sure. Thanks for that. Thanks for that, Jeremy. So maybe not exactly specific to the resilience topic, but because renewables, diversification, and potentially battery backup power supplies can be such an important contributor to resilience alternatives, I think it is significant to talk about the policy and regulatory framework for these solutions. The renewables legislative, legal, and policy and regulatory framework in the region has been particularly weak over the past years, and that is in fact changing. But there have not been measures like we've seen in the US, Europe, and elsewhere, which specifically encourage the use of these technologies. What we've seen first in a move towards some opening is certainly reduction or elimination of import duties on renewable equipment. That's an important move. What we're seeing increasingly, and I note that some of the bigger countries in the Caribbean, like Jamaica, have begun efforts to specifically attract renewables, and Jamaica in particular has used an auctions market where it's specified renewable investments, and that has led to over 100 megawatts of new renewables on grid. We see similar measures either through negotiated or auction basis in Puerto Rico and Dominican Republic. In the smaller island states, the OECS, which I was talking about previously, we're moving a bit slower in that direction, though new legislative or legal frameworks for governing the sector, and those tend to be monopoly, either private or public monopolies for the region, which oftentimes makes a lot of sense given the scale, the size of the country, and the market. But the new legislation is allowing for encouraging investments in renewables, either from the existing utility or from IPPs on a very specific basis. And so I'd say the trend is moving in the direction we're seeing renewables, for example, 3 megawatts of solar PV being constructed in St. Lucia. We're seeing substantial geothermal resource investigation in several countries, including Dominica, St. Lucia, St. Vincent, and the Grenadines. So I think we're moving in a good direction, though the fraction of renewables remains quite small.
I want to add anything to that, or?
Yeah, let me just amplify a bit. I do think, and Mark and I both know this quite well. I mean, we attend this Caribbean Renewable Energy Forum on a regular basis. It's been going on about 10 years. And I think the kind of the sense of the group last time was, oh, it's really happening now, as Mark said, Jamaica, other countries. So I do think there's clearly a movement towards on-the-ground real effects in some places and maybe more and more places of renewables. I do think that the one thing that's fascinating to me is that the interaction between sustainability and resilience is still an unsolved problem in a way. That many people are now, of course, saying, well, renewables are great because they are resilient, right? They're better. They don't need fuel. On the other hand, in Haiti, for example, and other places, solar panels get blown off, blown away. So I do think definitely renewable is incredibly important. Sustainability gaining traction immensely in various places. And I think there's still this kind of work that has to be done to see exactly how resilience and sustainability will play out. Ideally, they can both work together, but I don't think that's quite been figured out yet.
And I think there's a lot more to talk about there, but let's move on because we're going to run out of time quickly. And I want to ask this question. I think it's interesting, and it's a holistic question that I think both of your presentations dealt with, but perhaps you can complement. And it's this question of that energy infrastructure isn't the only vulnerable infrastructure, and in many cases needs to be coordinated with other infrastructure the questioner puts down, for example, industry, roads, transport. So how do you propose this to take place? And I think you both laid out some ideas, but I think beyond the communication systems, I mean, maybe talk a little bit more about the solutions that you've intimated in your formal remarks. And Adam, why don't we just start with you quickly and then go to Mark, and then we'll have one last question for both of you.
Yeah, this is Adam. I guess my immediate response is that the first step to solving a problem is recognizing the problem. And I am really curious about what Mark thinks about this. But I do think the recent season has made people much more aware of the interconnectedness, right? Interconnectedness. And so people now recognize that. I think most of the tools out there don't really do a good job of that. So people didn't figure out that, oh, geez, that road gets flooded, that fuel doesn't arrive, that generator stops running, even though maybe everything else is fine. I think people now realize that and are beginning to figure out how to develop systems, GIS or whatever, to have a better job of understanding those connections. But I would just be honest and say, I think so far it's been mostly recognizing that problem, and then they're kind of ad hoc solutions, like to the problem that I just raised, the hospital fuel depot problem. There hasn't been a good job so far, for understandable reasons, I think, of integrating these things in a kind of holistic way. That's kind of my view.
Mark, do you want to weigh in?
Yeah, so just briefly, to complement what Adam just said, because actually taken a holistic approach on this for many years, and quite frankly, we're taking a little bit more specific on energy, not to segment it and only in the power sector solution, but to better improve the way we treat the specific elements of electricity. But the bank, through its disaster risk management DRM programs, of which we have a branch of the bank that just does this, looks at all sectors in an integrated approach. And by that, we mean everything from roads, schools, hospitals, and housing, and the power sector. And so we agree fully that this is a integrated challenge, but because we work in energy since we're trying to look at the very specific challenge and ways in which we can mitigate the risk in the power sector to eventually complement the overall, that full integrated approach. But because of the really critical nature of power sector in both the immediate disaster recovery and the long-term reconstruction, we wanted to design some more specific tools to treat both generation, transmission, and distribution in this complex infrastructure configuration in many countries.
This, Adam, again, just sorry to take a little more time, but I do think, to say something very positive about what I thought Mark showed, I do think the Belize work is, at least was remarkable for the fact that I think it did look at the system. So at least as far as I could tell, it wasn't just saying, let's look only at one thing. It was basically looking at the geographic layout of various pieces and how they interact. And that's exactly what needs to be done.
I think you both have walked through the historical, this is receiving a lot of attention and has gained a lot of attention, but it's certainly nothing new or not an issue that we haven't, all of us in this space, been struggling to understand for years. So with that, let's wrap up, and thank everyone for joining us. And just a quick note about some upcoming webinars, stay tuned for that, and then next week we'll be live in Mexico City. But let me ask both of you in the way of a final remark or two. So, I thought it was very interesting, Mark, you talked about segmentation and the literal and literal and figurative low-hanging fruit that deals with vegetation and trying to maintain vegetation so that those things don't impact. But I kept hearing in all of your presentations, something perhaps that's also another, I don't know if it's low-hanging fruit, but to me a potential next step is the undergrounding question. And that seems to be a real near-term solution to a lot of the things you mentioned in terms of the poles and the system failures. It seems like just by undergrounding you would alleviate a great extent of that. So the question would be, in sort of a wrap-up, is there something else beyond that? And maybe the segmentation question, if you could explain that a little bit. And help us understand what all that might mean. Do all that in one sentence, if you don't mind. So, perfect. Thank you, guys. Mark?
Sure, I take a deep breath before we start my one long run-on sentence, and I'll tackle the undergrounding piece. It's hard to say exactly what the per segment, per mile or kilometer cost is, and it depends just significantly on the type of terrain, whether you're in an urban area with asphalt and cement, etc. But a general 5 and 8 costly to do grounding work than to place overhead lines, and so that's going to be cost prohibitive on a national basis. It's just most of these countries can't afford to do that across the board. So what I would say the low-hanging fruit with regards to deploying underground cable is generally going to be of densely populated urban centers and critical infrastructure, hospitals, police stations, shelters, and the like. And we think that the rest of the country can oftentimes survive with overhead lines, potentially more resilience, both newer wooden and concrete poles, and then segmentation, which involves both the ability to switch off it's in particular loops, but also to having distributed generation such that that those cutoff loops can be supplied with electricity when the rest of the system or other parts of the system may be down. Thank you.
Well, perfect. Thank you very much. Adam, last word, final thoughts, please.
Very quickly, well, on undergrounding, to relate to that and make it maybe more general, I do think that there are technological solutions, including lower cost undergrounding that I hear about, but I don't think we need to wait for those. I do think, just as Mark said, there's some low-hanging fruit we should take advantage of. There's some longer-term analysis we need to do, but I do think the time is, especially now after the hurricane season and before the next one, the time is to start moving forward.
Thank you so much, Mark Lambrides from the World Bank, Adam Borison, Nathan Associates. We appreciate your time and insights on this critical topic that is obviously one we'll continue to focus on. And thank you all for joining us here today at the Energy Webinar Series from the Institute of the Americas. Have a wonderful afternoon. We'll see you online here in the coming months, or hopefully next week or thereafter in person at one of the Institute of the Americas programs. Thanks so much. Good afternoon.
Thank you.